is it biblical, is it right to go into another culture and plant a church focused on a single people group? That's the big question that I want to address in a certain way. Is it biblical to plant churches focused on a single people group, whether around the world, Chinese for Chinese in an Indian village up in the mountains, or right here for white people, black people, Chinese people? Is it biblical to focus church planting efforts on a single people group? Now, to talk about that or to answer this question, I want to talk to you for a moment about a principle called the Homogeneous Unit Principle, all right? Everybody say that with me. Homogeneous, it means same kind, unit principle. So we'll just call it the HUP, right? The Homogeneous Unit Principle. Now, this principle has governed church planting, growth, and development efforts around the world for more than 50 years. It was actually in working, I suppose, before that, or people were doing it, didn't know it, but for more than 50 years, this principle has been taught throughout the world as the biblical and the right way to plant, grow, and develop churches. In other words, to focus your efforts on a single people group and give them, in the language, in their culture, the music they want, the preaching style they want, to make everything conducive for that people group. And this is the biblical, this is the right way to plant churches, not only around the world, but right here in the United States. Now, where did this principle come from? In the 1920s and 30s, there was a man named Donald McGavran. Donald McGavran was a third-generation missionary in the country of India. And he was working there in the 20s and 30s. Keep in mind, this is roughly 40 to 50 years after Darwin. And nobody up until McGavran had ever done, or at least been credited, with applying the scientific method to the study of church growth and development. So in other words, no one had ever looked at things like, how big is your church? What's the offering? How many people attended this Sunday from 1 year ago on this Sunday? So think about all the, in a sense, science or numeric work that goes into church studying. Nobody had ever done that. And McGavran was asked in the 20s and 30s, he became the field secretary of his small denomination in India, and he was asked by his denomination to figure out, why are some of our churches growing and why are others not? Simple question. So he applied scientific method, first person again in Christendom to ever apply the scientific method to the study of church planting, growth, and development. And what he found in those about 20 years or so is that churches in India, at least in their denomination, the ones that seemed to be doing well and thriving in numeric growth were churches that were focused on a single caste. Now keep in mind, in India, there's many castes, right? And different levels of castes, and I don't know all the names and everything. Maybe Kevin can enlighten us sometime. But there's all these different castes. And the ones that seemed to be growing were churches that were focused on a single caste. But the ones that were multi-caste, trying to bring diverse castes together, those weren't growing at the same pace or level. Many times they were just stagnant or flat. And from these studies, McGavran mined this principle that we now know as the Homogeneous Unit Principle, or the HUP. And the principle is this, that people come to Christ fastest when they don't have to jump through linguistic and cultural barriers. Y'all catch me? People come to Christ fastest when they don't have to jump through linguistic or cultural hurdles. And that makes sense, right? In other words, humanly speaking, while God can use any of us, God can use a white guy from Arkansas over in Chiang Mai to bring Taiwanese to the Lord, right? It can happen. But from a pragmatic standpoint, the fastest way to bring, let's just say, a first-generation Chinese person, the fastest way to come to Christ would be to link them with a first-generation Chinese believer, right? Why? Well, they don't have any language barrier. They know culture, right? They each know, they know their culture. You're able to become incarnate, so to speak, and take the gospel through the culture as opposed to it. So McGavran minds this principle: people come to Christ fastest when they don't have to jump through linguistic, cultural barriers, or including castes. So getting one caste to another, it's going to take longer than getting someone in the same caste to witness to someone in their same caste. You with me? So say this with me: people come to Christ fastest when they don't have to jump through linguistic or cultural hurdles. Now, fast forward a little bit of time. I won't give you so much of his history for sake of time here, but in 1966, McGavran comes to America, and he's established at the Fuller School of World Mission in LA. Fuller is a very prominent long-term seminary. Just think an Ivy League school kind of for seminaries, very reputable, very prominent. And McGavran in 66 gets there, and he teaches for the first time what today is called church growth. In fact, in Christendom throughout the world, there's a whole industry that dates back to 1966 called the church growth movement. You can Google it online. There's millions and millions of pages all focused on church growth. How do you plant a church? How do you grow a church quickly, etc., right? It all starts in 66 with McGavran. Now, by the way, I just want to mention this about his personality. First of all, he was a third-generation missionary, as I mentioned, in India. By 1950, his family had over 250 years of missionary service in the country of India. Okay, so tremendously steeped in missions was McGavran. And when McGavran set up the school on church growth in 1966 at Fuller, there was a couple things in mind. First of all, his passion was for the nations, right? I mean, 250 years your family's been serving overseas. His passion is for the nations. And also, he understood Americans. He understood the competitive nature of Americans. And he realized that his principle in his teaching on church growth could be slightly twisted, could be misapplied, and be used more for selfish gain than really for what his aim was. What was his aim? His aim was to draw pastors from the United States who spoke English into a program on church growth and move them to the foreign field to evangelize and disciple the nations. That's what he was trying to do. He was so focused on moving people to the world in terms of serving cross-culturally that for 6 years, from 1966 to 1972, you couldn't get into the Fuller School of Church Growth, World Evangelism, or Missions, etc., unless you were fluent in another culture, in a second culture outside of American culture, and as evidenced by either having lived 3 years on a foreign field somewhere else or by speaking a foreign language fluently. He put these restrictions in for 6 years to keep people out who didn't have a heart for the nations. Y'all with me? In 1972, another man had gotten involved at that time. This man's name is Peter Wagner. And by 1972, within 6 years, there is such a bang on the door from American pastors like Rick Warren, etc., people that you might have heard of today are some of the early students of McGavran and Church Growth. But by 72, so many people want to get in this program. In fact, his first class, McGavran, 4 students signed up. By the next semester, you couldn't get in. High demand from American pastors to get in, but he kept them out unless they were focused on the foreign field and with that as a passion. He kept them out 6 years, but you know how schools work, right? You got to have students, you got to have money to keep the whole thing going. And by 72, Fuller threw open the doors and let anybody come in, whether you could speak a foreign language, live in a foreign field, etc., whatever. So it was like Katie bar the door, here they came, right? And American pastors flooded into the church growth program at Fuller, at the School of World Mission Evangelism, etc., and to study under McGavran and Peter Wagner. Check this out. In 1972, when the doors get flung open, that principle gets changed, slightly changed by Peter Wagner. Okay? And before I tell you what the principle is changed to, let me remind you also that in the 50s and 60s, we have in this country the development of television. And with the development of television comes in a whole new way of looking at the market, at target marketing, at demographic work, right? Hey, here's what 18 to 24-year-old single women, this is what they want. And they figured out which shows that they look for, and they market to that demographic, right? All that is really being taken to a whole new level with the invention of TV. And so in the 50s and 60s, early said, this is all happening at the time McGavran's teaching church growth. Now remember the principle? People come to Christ fastest when they don't have to jump through linguistic and cultural barriers. In 72, from then on, Wagner changes the principle, and guess how it's been taught ever since? The church grows fastest when you target a single people group. The church grows fastest when you target a single people group. Now, here's the problem. Number one, the biggest underroot problem with that is not biblical. Nowhere in the Bible, in the New Testament, as the church develops, is anyone encouraged to, hey, hurry up and get a lot of people to come. It happens in Jerusalem, it happens in Antioch, people are coming, but not because of this principle. The principle is changed. And the focus of the American church, and therefore the global church, for more than 50 years, has been explosive church growth. How big can we grow? How fast can we grow real big? And you do that when you target a single people group. whether Chinese, Hispanic, white, black, whatever, and you target them and you say, what do they like? What kind of preaching style do they like? What kind of music do they like? What color of the carpet do they like? What kind of children's ministry? And you give them what they want, and what do they become? Consumers. And you market to your demographic niche, and you grow big churches real fast. Again, the big problem is this: it's not biblical. It's not biblical. Now, I actually have an ebook on this. Martin, show up the first slide. I just want you to see the cover of it. It's called "Should Pastors Accept or Reject the Homogeneous Unit Principle?" And what happens is 1978, it's 6 years after this principle is subtly changed by Peter Wagner, where the emphasis is on how fast can we grow big churches. 6 years later, Dr. Martin Marty at the University of Chicago, one of the foremost scholars on American religious history, challenges this principle in writing in a magazine article, and he says, is the principle biblical? And this leads to an exchange of 2 letters between Donald McGavran and Martin Marty. And we have McGavran's letters back to Martin Marty today. Take a look at what McGavran says about this principle. Next slide, please, Martin. McGavran's concern, again, is from the beginning, it was intentional cross-cultural evangelism and discipleship of the nations. It was not the building of large churches full of people who look just like you, whoever you are. And he addresses this in this statement. Next slide. He says to Martin Marty, do I beg of you, think of it, that is the homogeneous unit principle, think of it primarily as what? A missionary and an evangelistic principle. Now, let me separate this nuance for you. In other words, what is biblical about the HUP is this. If you target a people group for evangelism, for discipleship, or for leadership development and training, totally biblical to target a people group for what? Say it with me. Evangelism, discipleship, leadership development. That's totally biblical. You know who practiced the HUP in the Bible? Jesus. He crossed a culture. He was in heaven. He crossed a culture, came to earth. He became a Jew. He ate like Jews. He slept with the Jews. He spoke the Jewish language. He became incarnate in Jewish culture. And what did he do? He evangelized Jews. He discipled Jews. And he developed the leaders amongst the Jews and gave them a vision for what? The nations. Matthew 28. But in his humanity, Jesus never, ever planted a church. Did you know that? In his humanity, Jesus never planted a church. And outside of Jerusalem, there's not one church in the entire New Testament that is planted focused on a single people group. Every single church outside of Jerusalem in the New Testament is what we say today multi-ethnic. Jews and Gentiles walking, working, worshiping God together as one. Why? To present a credible witness of God's love for all people so that the world would come to know him as we do. So, if you're targeting a people group for evangelism, discipleship, or leadership development, totally biblical to target a people group. But the second you cross the line and say, we're going to start a church, you know there is no biblical license, there is no freedom, there is no mandate in the Word of God to start a church focused on a single people group. None. It doesn't exist. Now, inevitably someone says, well, what about... the tribal village in the mountains of the Himalayas. Everybody's the same person, right? So what can you do about that? Well, that's certainly true. But think broader than just ethnicity, right? Because in every tribe, there's always a chief, and there are people down here, right? Right? You even see that. Sometimes it's handicapped. They're looked down on certain villages because they can't walk or they're missing an arm or something. The point is that the church is for all people. Whether you're the chief or you're crawling around without legs, as you see sometimes on TV, they show the villages and people, no matter what your status is, here's the thing, the church is free of distinction. So it's not just the color of our skin or our ethnic background, it's class, it's distinction. Those are all eradicated in Ephesians chapter 2 through the blood of Christ. There are no distinctions, and the church is to be for all people. And in James 2, he tells us, don't give favor to the rich guy. All people are one. There's the level ground at the foot of the cross. Can I get a witness? You understand what I'm saying? So this is what is true. And so sometimes people ask me about that, and they have these hypotheticals, right? But the fact is, in every place all over the world, there's always somebody on top, somebody on bottom. Sometimes it's skin color, sometimes it's class or pecking order. The point is that in the Bible, there's no freedom to start a church just for the chief and people like him. It's for everyone when you cross that line. Now, McGavran recognized the intrinsic problem with people misunderstanding and applying this principle. And he actually speaks to it in the next slide. He writes to Martin Marty, look, there is a danger, of course, that congregations applying the HUP become exclusive, arrogant, and racist. And that danger must be resolutely combated. Let those words sink into you for a moment. In 1978, the founder of the very principle itself projects and says, if people misapply this and focus it on what we would say fast, rapid church growth, all so they can build their own kingdoms, full of people who look just like them, who like the music they like, who eat the same foods they like, who speak the same language. It's all about us, the consumer, and they grow big. Look what he says. There's a danger that those churches become exclusive, arrogant, and racist. And that danger, he said, must be resolutely combated. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but let me just ask you, do you know of in your heart or suspect any specific church that you're aware of that you would say, if asked, is exclusive or appears to be exclusive, arrogant, or racist? Do you know of a church like that? Don't raise your hand. But you know, all over the country, when I speak on this subject, I ask the pastors that same question. And McGavran foresaw this in 1978. People come to Christ fastest when we target a people group. No biblical license or freedom to start churches for single people groups. And now in our country, let's say, in our country, of course, it's been white majority in power for many, many centuries, obviously. That's changing, as someone already alluded to, but this has been our past, right? So whites not understanding this, and maybe there were some, but the vast majority of white churches didn't allow for African American involvement, right? Or to accept the Chinese or even Hispanics, and this led to those cultures starting their own churches, right? To protect cultural identity, sometimes for language, etc. Because heretofore in the last 10 years, although there's a smattering of folks that are different, white churches want you to assimilate into our culture. Hey, we'd love for anyone to show up and be a part of our church as long as they like it the way we do things. That's called assimilation. And by the way, black churches today, lots of people I meet, they want diversity, but they want it in that way. And we call that assimilation. So whatever your culture, it could be a white guy going to a black church. We're asked, in a sense, to check our culture at the door. And as long as you embrace, and we'll show you, here's how the sermons work, here's how small groups work, here's how everything works, and if you like it the way we do things, then we could be one big happy church. That's called assimilation, and that's not how you build a biblical or healthy multi-ethnic church. But it's accommodation. In other words, you're asking cultures to come into the church and bring their culture with them. And respect and honor it and learn from one another. This is what Paul talks about in Ephesians 3. He says, I pray that you would know the height, the breadth, the length, the depth of God's love. And understand and feel that he speaks that to a multi-ethnic church. In other words, he's saying, hey, maybe the blacks got the height, the breadth of God's love, but they don't have the depth, the length, the breadth. Maybe the whites, we got the length, but we don't have the breadth. You see what I'm saying? It takes a little bit of every one of us to get this full prism of God's manifold wisdom to the world, and he wants us collectively to experience that. And this is what he prays for the church in Ephesus there when he does so. So all that's to say is that the import and the impact of this message, both here locally and around the country and even around the world, is strategically important. And we are making a difference and a dent in these statistics. In fact, let me just back up and say this. Let me give you an illustration of what this assimilation accommodation thing is. That phrase, e pluribus unum, that we have on our coinage, right? From the many one. It comes from a poem by Virgil 150 years or so before the time of Christ. And the phrase is used for a salad. That's where we get the phrase. From the tomatoes, the cucumber, the onion, the lettuce, we get all, right? From the many ingredients of the salad, we get one salad. But my good friend, Dr. Sung Cha Ra, up at North Park Seminary in Chicago, when he speaks about this, he says, see, here's what the white church has done throughout the centuries. We're out to change that. I'm a white guy trying to change that. right? But he said, what we did is we got all the lettuce, tomato, everything, and then we pour ranch sauce over the whole thing. So you can't taste the tomatoes because they taste like ranch sauce. You can't taste the cucumbers with ranch sauce. You see what I'm saying? What we want for this church and the American church and the global church is get rid of the sauce. Get rid of the sauce so you can enjoy the tomatoes and the lettuce and the cucumber. And from the many, we can be one. And by the way, this is our destiny, whether you like it or not. Just like an individual is moving towards sanctification in Christ. So when I see him, I will be like him face to face. So is the church. You know what our destiny is? Revelation 7:9. Every nation, tribe, people, and tongue worshiping God together as one. It's the destiny of the church, whether you like it or not. So all that's to say is that we should be pursuing on earth as it is in heaven. And this idea, and the last thing I'll say is this, in America now, there's no longer an excuse. You see what I'm saying? In the past there were, and by the way, for churches that want to remain homogeneous and focused on their culture, or whites or blacks, whatever, God bless them. You hear what I just said? God bless them. And I just look at that as old wine. You know, Jesus didn't slam on the old wine. He didn't put it down. He just said, fine, let them enjoy the old wine. But we're out pouring some new wine. And since this church started in 2001, 12 years ago, only 7.5% of churches in America had 20% diversity in their attending membership. Today, that number is 13.7, 14.4 in Protestant evangelicalism. The sociologists who do the statistician work, they say that's seismic change to double that percentage in a 10-year period, and it's only going to grow. And we are making an impact through our collective effort and our collective voice. And I want you to know that around the world and right here in the United States.